The fighting, you can hear, is getting closer now from the right as these other units are as the units on the of Polk's wing are starting to engage, and then the most left unit of the right wing is engaged next to General Stuart's division of the left wing, which is this wing over here, Longstreet's wing. So the word comes down through the right wing to General Stuart's division that it's time for the left wing to attack. The word comes over to General Longstreet. Longstreet tells Hood. Hood's the tactical commander of this column, and he gives him the nod, and he tells him to attack. General Hood tells General Bushrod Johnson, who's got the 3 lead brigades, he's got echelons number 1 and number 2 of the 5, move forward, attack. So Bushrod Johnson steps off, and he starts coming through the woods over here, 2 brigades abreast, about 400 yards wide, attack formation. So I want to say a few things about this type of formation. In the military, we learn that to be reasonably assured of successfully penetrating an enemy defensive line, all things being equal, meaning that the enemy, the defenders, have not had a lot of time to prepare a defense with works of some kind, trench line, whatever. You need about a 3-to-1 attacker to defender force ratio advantage to have that advantage and be reasonably assured that you're going to be successful in rupturing that line. Now, a lot of this came from the early 20th century, the end of the First World War, 1918. The German Great Offensive of April 1918, the Germans tried to figure out how do we break the deadlock of this 4 years of trench warfare. It's been nothing but stalemate from the Swiss border all the way up to the English Channel. No war of movement anymore. A German colonel by the name of Houdier came up with the idea that we were going to create some storm battalions, we're going to train them and change their way of thinking, that they're going to be taught to hurry up and rush an enemy line and just take care of the troops right in front of them, punch through and get into the rear areas. They're going to make holes, and then the heavy units are going to follow them and they're going to go through the holes. And the difference in thinking was they're not to become decisively engaged with the flanks, with the shoulders of the hole that they make. They pour through and keep going, just keep going. Well, the Germans did this in 1918 very successfully, and they did rupture the line, and they restored the war of movement for a while, and they tried to drive on Paris, so they were stopped outside of Paris, and well, we all know what happened in the end. They lost the war. There was an armistice. But these ideas were not forgotten. The guys who were the captains and lieutenants in the First World War, stayed in the Army, continued to develop this, and when mechanization happened in the 1930s, a tank, half-tracks and wheeled vehicles, they adjusted this for these new assets, these 2 new weapons, and that becomes guys like General Heinz Guderian. We call him in the military kind of the grandfather of offensive armored warfare, which got the nickname Blitzkrieg later. Well, the Germans called this idea the Schwerpunkt. That's the word I've got on here on this slide. The idea, it means being at the main point of where you're going to make the attack, and it sort of has 2 meanings. One is where where you're selecting the point of the attack. That really pertains to the defender, and then where you, the attacker, are going to have the main weight of your attack. And the other thing about it is it should be narrow but long. And a narrow but long column, instead of what they were doing in the Civil War for the most part, going back to the Napoleonic period, lining up divisions one at a time. When you line up a division, most of your divisions, let's say they're a 3-brigade division. You have, like Bushrod Johnson here, you have 2 up and 1 back. So that means your depth at any point is really 2 brigades for half your division and maybe just 1 division. Longstreet, when he designs this attack column, he assumes that there's a division over here, probably your standard 3-brigade division, so it's going to have a depth of 2 brigades. Now what really happens is it's Major General Wood. He doesn't know that. General Wood's division is only 2 brigades, so it's a depth of 1. And then something else is going to happen that they don't know about is, of course, Wood's going to move, which is what I have depicted on this other slide, them sliding over. But anyway, the point I want to make is, as I said before, this was not a mistake. This was not happenstance. He thought this through. He had what to learn from. What happened at Gettysburg, a very wide front attack over an open area, pounded by artillery all the way. So by the time he closed with the enemy on Cemetery Ridge, they don't have any mass. They don't have enough force structure left after they've been attrited by the artillery and so on and so forth. So this changes all of that. Here, look at this. Comes out of the wood line from here to here where the 100th Illinois pickets are. Well, actually the pickets are up here around the Brotherton cabin, but this is a very short distance to close. There's no artillery facing him, so he's got all kinds of advantage. Here, the whole column is covered by the woods. They can't even see it until it's on top of them. Whereas in Gettysburg, you have no advantages if you're the attacker. So that's one of the things he was trying to improve upon. Now, I make comparison to what happened in the future in the First World War and the Second World War. Desert Storm, I was in one of these, a huge one of these kind of attack columns. Schwerpunkt, also in Desert Storm, much wider than this. But Longstreet doesn't have these things to look back on. These were in the future. So he figures this out on his own. That's pretty amazing if you ask me. So that's kind of why I call him consider him a modern thinking general. So that's the point I wanted to make on this. Now I want to flip to your next page to this one with Bushrod Johnson here. I want to say a few things about Bushrod Johnson as well. He doesn't get a lot of due in any of the history books. I've hardly read anything about him other than his name. Most of the time he's the division commander or brigade commander or whatever. And I think he's a piece of the puzzle of why this was also not a mistake, not happenstance, not something he just had to settle for. Bushrod Johnson was born in Ohio, near St. Clairsville in the east in 1817 to a Quaker family. He died in 1880 in Illinois, a small town called Brighton, Illinois. He was buried there, stayed there until his body stayed there until 1975. As I said, his family were Quakers. They were well, Quakers, Orthodox ones who were originally the Friends from the colonial period and so on, were against war. So going into the military and all that was kind of not what they usually did. There were Quaker soldiers and whatnot, but he decided he wanted to be one, so that sort of was different for a Quaker. His family were, most of his family were ardent abolitionists as well, and he was an abolitionist before he went to West Point. He participated in sneaking runaway Negro slaves over the river into his county and engaging in the activities like setting up safe houses and whatnot and getting them fed and whatnot until they ran off to where they were going to go, probably Canada further north, to avoid the fugitive slave laws, recovery by private investigators or whatnot. Bushrod Johnson went to West Point. He was class of 1840. Longstreet was class of 1842, but in the record it's known that they knew each other at West Point. Bushrod Johnson was one of his classmates, best known classmates was William Tecumseh Sherman, also class 1840, and they seemed to know each other pretty well at West Point and some other points. After the war, Sherman makes a comment about Bushrod Johnson that that they had a meeting sometime in 1860. They were both working as faculty on various military academies in the South, and Sherman made a comment that he didn't care for Bushrod Johnson's attitude about states' rights being more important than the federal level being over the state. So there's part of the difference there, the rub between the two sides going into the Civil War. Bushrod Johnson's formative assignments at the company grade as a lieutenant were similar to some of these, a lot of the other major officers that we know. He served with Grant in Louisiana. His first assignment was Jefferson Barracks in Missouri. So he was there before Longstreet and Grant, but he had some overlap with them there. He also went to Florida in the Seminole campaign, so he probably had some, probably crossed paths with Longstreet there as well. And then everybody goes to Mexico, of course. Bushrod Johnson was commissioned an infantry officer Like all the other peers, he wanted to do well. He wanted to be recognized for conspicuous gallantry in battle, and he was hoping to do that in Mexico. He had been in a couple of battles in the early phase of the Mexican War, but at the very end, he was assigned to the Commissary Corps, the Logistics Corps, and he wasn't too thrilled about that because there's no glory in that, and he had to deal with headaches and just getting the ammunition and the food and all the supplies and whatnot to the troops. And there's no recognition, no brevet is that they were looking for. Brevet is the term for promotion. A lot of these guys wanted to come out of that hoping they might be a captain out of the Mexican War. When the war is over, the Army is still down there as an army of occupation, and he's starting to see that there is this culture of corruption starting to happen within the logistics realm. A lot of businessmen, American businessmen, come down from the United States. They want to get contracts. Also, some Mexican businessmen want to get contracts, and there is this atmosphere of venality going on. And Bushrod Johnson gets approached by a contractor at one point and has asked that if you go with us, there's something in it for you. And Bushrod Johnson, this is when he gets in trouble. He writes a letter to his immediate supervisor, who is in New Orleans, in Louisiana, saying, you know, what about this contractor? If we go with them, there might be something in it for us. This guy gets it and reads it and says, oh, we got somebody who's not following the regulations, is an integrity violation. He tells his first-line supervisor, who's a brigadier general, that we have an officer who's doing something wrong. So Bushrod Johnson is summoned to New Orleans. He stands in front of a tribunal, and the general officer, says to him, Lieutenant, did you write this letter? And that's when Bushrod Johnson comes clean, and he says he did. I'm sorry, I should have never done that. I had a lapse of judgment. Can you give me another chance? He hopes that he'll just punish him and mentor him and let him continue on with his career, because he wanted to be an Army officer. Well, this time in American military history, the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, President Polk at the time, was involved with decisions like this, with discipline and or kicking people out of the Army, letting officers go. The general informs President Polk, and he tells Lieutenant Bushrod Johnson, you probably should write a letter to the President making your case. He does. He writes the letter of his life, hoping that he'll save his career. He has to wait about a week or two, and word does come back from President Polk, but it doesn't go to Bushrod Johnson, it goes to the one-star. President Polk said, well, I'm not going to punish him, I'm not going to court-martial him, but I suggest you tell Lieutenant Johnson that he resign his commission, because we got to have guys with high integrity working in this sort of business, especially when it comes to pecuniary liability with contracts and money and whatnot.